So we are. Yeah. Welcome everybody. My name is Benjamin Solitaire, not New York City Civic Engagement Commission. I'll have to change that, but Benjamin Solitaire, the Community Board Advisor for the Civic Engagement Commission. Welcome to, I see I'm joined by a co-worker, Catherine Gow. Nice to see you here. Welcome to tonight's presentation, as it says on the screen, of the Disability Awareness and Etiquette and Awareness Training, hosted by MOPD, given by Arthur Jacobs tonight and Eli Ramos. Thank you so much for both being here. It is a really important training, really valuable. We have other people signed up, but we don't want to waste your time for being prompt, so we will get underway. Let me just say, the CEC, in addition to these trainings and others that we'll be hosting in the coming weeks, both with MOPD and on parliamentary procedure, does several things. Of course, we provide these community board trainings for everybody. We do poll site interpretation. So in case you didn't know, it is early voting, and we have poll site interpreters at certain locations around the city providing interpretation into languages other than what the BOE provides. And we, of course, also have the People's Money, the first citywide participatory budgeting process. From now until November 19th, there are sessions around the city for people to come in and tell us how they want to spend a part of the city budget, or you can suggest an idea to us online. I'll put a link into that a little later. But for now, let's get going. The reason you're here, I'll hand it off to Arthur to lead us on this fantastic training. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Benjamin. Welcome, everybody. Again, Arthur Jacobs from the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities. I'm the Digital Accessibility Coordinator there. I'm a Caucasian or white male in my mid-40s with blonde hair and blue eyes. I do identify as blind. So again, welcome to Disability Etiquette and Awareness. I'm going to do a quick access check. If you have questions that you would like for us to answer, you can post them in the chat. You can also use the raise hand feature and we'll address you, or you can unmute and just ask your question. I don't mind being interrupted. I don't think Eli minds either. And we should have some time at the end as well for questions. We do have here in Zoom the auto captioning feature. So if you'd like to turn those on, just click the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom window. I mentioned raising hands before. Just want to make sure people understand. I mean, raise your Zoom hand. I remember early on in the Zoom days, like we'd say, raise your hand, and people would be in their videos, raising their hand. But just so that's clear. All right. If I'm not loud enough or I'm speaking too quickly, please let us know, and we'll make the appropriate adjustments. All right. So we are MOPD. We are a liaison agency that works with other city agencies and offices in order to ensure that their programs and services are accessible to people with disabilities. We will be sharing, or I think Benjamin already has shared, the slide deck. So you have all this information. No need to, quickly try to take notes. You'll have it. And so we also work with the disability community to make sure we understand, the issues that are going on in the community right now, and let them know about how to access city services and programs. All right, so today's agenda, we're going to start with an introduction to disability, then talk about the laws and statistics around disability here in the city, a little bit about language, some basics on interacting with people with disabilities, and some basic etiquette, then dive into different disability types and talk more specifically about interacting with folks with particular kinds of disabilities, and then talk a bit at the end about some resources. All right, so our intro to disability is going to cover the models of disability, a little bit about disability justice, and disability glossary, which will just level set on some terms. All right, so the first model of disability is the medical model. And you'll see here that there is the international symbol of access surrounded by 4 red arrows pointing towards it. And that symbol of access is the kind of the classic person using a wheelchair, except that they're in motion, right? They're going someplace. The reason for this graphic is that the medical model of disability really focuses on what a person can't do. and aims to kind of normalize people with disabilities, fix them, make them more quote unquote normal like everybody else. So if I was to meet somebody for the first time who saw a disability this way, they would probably ask me questions like, oh, have you tried laser surgery? I'm blind. What about the bionic eye? I saw that on TV. That's real, right? That exists. Have you tried that? Things that, suggestions that might try, quote unquote, fix me or make me more normal. But the social model of disability, which our office really focuses on, and again, we have that same international symbol of accessibility, but this time surrounded by 4 green arrows pointing away from the person, because this model really focuses on what people can do and sees disability as a social construct. In other words, a person experiences their disability when they experience disabling conditions, right? So let's say I'm going for a job interview, I'm a wheelchair user, I get to the building and there's stairs. There isn't a ramp, there isn't a lift, there isn't another entrance that's accessible, so I can't get in the building. I can't go up, do my interview, so I'm stuck, right? I'm experiencing a disabling condition at that point. But if I roll up to the building and there are no stairs, just you roll right in, or there's a ramp, or there's a lift, or another accessible entrance, then I can get in the building and get up to my interview. I can, do my best, and I have the same opportunities as every other person that applied, right? So in that case, I'm not experiencing a disabling condition. So as a blind person, now I'm switching, as a blind person, if I was to meet somebody who saw disability using the social model, they would come to the conversation already with assumptions that I can, do those basic things that pretty much everybody else can do. Like, but they might ask questions related to how I might get it done. They may not understand how, given that I can't see. So they might ask questions like, oh, how do you cross the street? How do you use a smartphone? How do you use a computer, right? And they'd be curious about how I get things done, with the assumption that I do get them done, right? So this model really focuses on the fact that if we remove barriers, we empower people with disabilities to live up to their full potential. There we go. So disability justice is I don't know if it's a sub-movement or an addition to the movement of disability rights, but it was started in order to really acknowledge the fact that anybody with a disability is more than their disability, right? I'm more than just a person who's blind. I'm more than just my blindness. I'm male. I'm white. I'm, mid 40s. I'm this, I'm that. All of these things that make me who I am influence the way that I experience blindness. And some other blind person is going to experience it differently because of all of the factors that make them who they are. And so it really celebrates this idea of intersectionality and how that can influence a person's experience of disability. All right, so a disability glossary. These are some common terms that we use within the realm of disability. And so accessibility refers to something that is available and usable by people with disabilities. Not just that it's there and it's out there and it's, I hear a lot, somebody will say, oh yeah, well, that program's accessible. They opened their doors last week. But this really, when we say accessibility, we're really talking about, is it usable by everybody, including people with disabilities? Ableism is the idea that a person without a disability is more capable than, more competent than, better than, better off than a person with a disability. And we see ableism a lot in the language that we use, as well as sometimes the attitudes that color our stereotypes. And basic beliefs about people with disabilities. So we just want to call that out and make sure that folks understand that people with disabilities can be just as capable as everybody else. Remember the social model, disability is a social construct. So when we remove those barriers, we all kind of are on that level playing field. Inspiration, this refers to the fact that people with disabilities are often seen as inspirational, right? Just because of, the fact that they have a disability and are doing regular everyday things. Just because I'm a blind guy and I'm crossing the street to go to work doesn't really make me very inspirational. That's just a normal thing. Everybody does it. At least everybody who walks in the city does it. And it's just one of those things, right? There's really nothing inspirational about it. If I'm Eric Weinmeier, the first blind guy to climb Mount Everest, okay, that's inspirational, right? I certainly wouldn't be able to do that. I'm guessing most people on this call, if not everybody on the call, wouldn't be able to do it. So that's inspirational. That's appropriate. But just those everyday things, just because they're disabled, doesn't make it inspirational. Then we have this idea of independence and interdependence. Sometimes people think these are mutually exclusive, right? But in reality, they're not. A person who's independent, and I'm guessing we all think, everybody here thinks they're independent or thinks of themselves as independent. But we all depend on other people. We are interdependent on our support, our family, our friends, the society in general, government. We all rely on these things to help us be independent, right? To be successful in this world. So the idea of independence really is about agency. It's this idea that to be independent means that I have control over the things that are happening to me, for me, about me. I'm deciding what kind of help that I need or don't need. I'm deciding what kind of job that I want, what kind of education that I want, what kind, all of these things. I'm making those decisions. I'm probably getting support in that, advice and whatever, but I'm the one making the decision. I'm the one in control of my own life, right? And that makes me independent. And then intersectionality, we just talked about that, so I'm not going to spend any more time on it. All right, so we're going to move into the laws and statistics. We're going to talk about the legal definition of disability and then look at what disability looks like here in the city. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, passed in 1990, was the first law that really defined disability. And it defined it as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. Now, you might ask yourself, well, what's a major life activity? These are things like walking, talking, eating, sleeping, breathing, thinking, going to work, right? All of these things that we just kind of do on an everyday basis. I'm going to school for those who don't go to work yet. That just all these things that we do that make up, our lives. So when it impacts one or more of those, it becomes a disability. And then the ADA was amended in the early 2000s rather. And they added a couple other things to it, which is a record of having such an impairment or being regarded as having such an impairment. So with those two additional things, you would also be considered disabled under the law. And then the New York City Human Rights Law also has a definition of disability, which is very similar to the ADA's. The major difference is that it doesn't use the word substantially. And so it's more protective. A fun fact, the New York City Human Rights Law is actually one of the most protective human rights laws in the country. All right, so some statistics here in the city. There's a little pie chart on the left side there that shows the portion of New York City's population that reports having a disability compared to those that don't. It's about 11%, at just under a million people. We actually think that that's probably low, just given the national and international statistics around disability. and that these are self-reported numbers, gathered by the Census Bureau through the ACS. We think it's probably more like 15 to 20%. So we think it's a little low. The census breaks disability down into these 6 different categories. And of course, you can fit into more than one of the categories. So the total number at the top is just anybody who identifies as having one or more of these. So if you added all these up, you would get way more than that 985,000 number. It's more like 2.5 million. So that's the reason why, it's kind of hard to know exactly how many people have disabilities because of all the different ways that it's counted. And some people don't see themselves as being disabled or even understand that they are based on the definition, right? Some people have asked in the past when we do these presentations, what's a self-care disability? Think of self-care disabilities as ones that impact your ability to take care of yourself, right? So things like toileting, bathing, eating, those kinds of activities. And then independent living disabilities are those that impact your ability to live independently. So think shopping, cleaning, laundry, cooking, going to work, that kind of thing. All right. Now we're going to move into language, and I'm going to pass it over to Eli.
All right, great, Arthur. Thanks so much. Thank you all for being here. My name is Eli Ramos. I'm the Business Engagement Associate for NYC at Work, which is the employment wing of MOPD. I'm a Latino male in my early 30s, olive skin, black hair, wearing a burgundy sweater. Let's see, in the background, as you see throughout the slides, I have the New York City skyline behind me. Next slide. Oh, before we do that, we're going to do an overview of language. We're going to go over the concepts of people first and identity first and what that means, and also just general things to avoid. All right. So with disability language, we have, 2 forms of language, empowering language and offensive language. Within empowering language, there are 2 sort of schools of thought here, person first versus identity first. And it's not to say that one is above the other, but both are used within the community. And we also have offensive language, slurs, euphemisms, metaphors, and just plain old negative language I'd personally never like to hear again. Next slide. So with people first language, logically put the person first. So person with a disability, people with disabilities in the plural, rather than disabled person, disabled people, or even worse, as you see written here, crippled, the handicapped. That's probably a word you might have been using up until 5 minutes ago, and that's okay. We're not here to wag a finger in anyone's face, certainly not. But it is a word that has become passé due to its condescending sort of negative nature. So for specific disabilities, you want to say person who uses a wheelchair, person who has cerebral palsy, person who is blind, person who is deaf, etc., etc. And if you're not sure what to use, just ask. The quickest way to get my attention is by just saying my name. But if you need to embellish, this is the way to do so with people first. Okay. So with identity first language, it's the same thing on its head. So disabled people, disabled person, rather than the people first model. For specific disabilities, blind person, deaf person, autistic person, etc., etc. If you're not sure what to use, just ask. All right, so here's some outdated terms and metaphors as well. Handicapped, we covered that one already. It's the concept of folks in the community needing handouts all the time, and a lot of folks with disabilities that disagree with that sentiment. Or are actively trying to change it. So for that reason, we avoid that word. Crippled, that's another one that, depending on the generation you're from, you might have been using. It's certainly, depending on what version of the good book you're reading, it's in there too. But King James was written 400 years ago. There's the R word, which I won't dignify by saying out loud, but you all see it there. Wheelchair bound. Folks that use wheelchairs are not bound by their wheelchairs. That's, in fact, the reason you're seeing them is because of it. Visually impaired, hearing impaired. It's the word impairment we take issue with. And granted, Arthur did use it in his definition earlier when defining disability, but did so in a legal sense. In social interactions, it's a word that we would like you all to avoid. We had an old colleague, Wale, who was blind, and he would say he was only impaired when he was imbibing. So there's that, right? Metaphors. So blindsided, blindness as a metaphor for ignorance or a metaphor for lack of ability or lack of knowledge, right? And stone deaf, falling on deaf ears. You might pick up a newspaper and say the economy was paralyzed by XYZ, right? You know, the media loves using disability terms for some reason, and we all know how they sensationalize things, so don't be like the media. And certainly don't use these types of expressions. All right. Okay, so negative language and insults, right? So we see here victim, sufferer. You'll find that a lot of folks with disabilities don't consider themselves to be victims of anything or suffering from anything. You know, it's just one aspect of who they are. Back to Arthur's point about intersectionality, just one piece of the whole, right? Physically challenged. I think we all are, aren't we? We're all bound by the laws of physics, as per Isaac Newton, which is also 400 years old. So there's that as well. But it's also the concept of, well, what are you describing by saying that? Because if you're talking about disability, then say disability. You know, what the community appreciates more than anything now is a bit of directness. Let's call things for what they are, because it's the only way that we enact change. If we're afraid to say the D word, then how are we going to change things, right? So insults, stupid, dumb, idiot, moron, cripple, gimp, spaz, I've heard them all. I'll hear them again. I just don't want to hear them from any of you. Next slide. So avoiding euphemisms and slangs as well. Euphemisms such as differently abled, handy-capable. Apart from just being cringeworthy, these are also echoing back to that previous sentiment. Well, what are we describing? Are we describing disability? So then let's say disability, because these terms were usually created by folks without disabilities to describe people with disabilities because it made them feel uncomfortable, right? Special needs is something else that falls into this category, but it's something we tread lightly with given the DOE's mandates, and no mother likes to hear that their child isn't special. But at the same time, it is a term that has become passé for the same reason. Slang, there goes that R word again. Crazy, lame. You might say you had a crazy commute to work this morning, or you might say that the Elvis movie was quite lame. But there are more eloquent ways to say that, right? You could say that you had a wild commute to work or a ridiculous one. You could say that the Elvis movie was lackluster, which it was. I don't know if anyone saw it, but it definitely was. All right, next slide. So disability etiquette basics, we covered a bit of language. Now we're going to go into interactions and also accessibility considerations. So with interactions, for one, you don't want to assume that everyone with a disability needs assistance. Sometimes the struggle is important. Think back to your childhood selves when you were learning to walk, to read, to dress, to use the bathroom, all these daily life activities as Arthur was describing, right? So you don't want to take that away from somebody if it's not necessary. The struggle is important, both for emotional well-being and also for rehabilitative purposes too. So you always want to ask before you help, and no means no, even if you think otherwise. But if the answer is yes, what you do want to do is ask how you can assist. It's not so much the if, but the how. Don't just go into it without asking how to do something, right? You always want to speak directly to the person with a disability, not to their companion or their interpreter or their significant other. Don't ask the significant other how they would like the salmon cooked. The salmon is for the individual. So only he or she would know how they would like it cooked, right? Don't ask personal questions too. Apart from being rude and abrasive, it could just come off as misplaced. Also, personal questions often require personal answers. One of my favorite movie quotes from one of my favorite movies is your question isn't indiscreet, but the answer might be. Meaning, you have to consider is 8:30 on the 96 2 and 3 platform the right time and venue to be asking this question? And am I just being nosy, or do I really have to do I really want to know what this person has to say, right? And also, don't assume someone does not have a disability just because you cannot see it. It is not in the frame, but I am a wheelchair user, so surprise. But beckons to the point of not assuming just because it's not detectable or not seen, right? Moving on. Accessibility considerations. You want to think about access in all of your programs and services, much like we have today, even with our small crowd here. You want to be mindful of scheduling events and meetings, asking those pertinent questions. Is this location easy to get to? How are the bathrooms? What is the process for checking in with security in the lobby? These kinds of questions. And even in the virtual space as well, making sure that your platform is accessible. Zoom by bar none is the most accessible, and that's not a product endorsement. That's just the facts of life. But also you want to include access language in your event promotions as well. And that doesn't just mean language about accessibility, but that means the language itself. Maybe cutting out a few of those SAT words, or avoiding figures of speech and euphemistic language that could go over some people's heads, disability or not, right? And also being prepared to hire accessibility professionals, which we usually do. Our other colleague is deaf and presents via ASL, but since he's tied up with some other things, we forewent the need for interpreters this time around. But again, you at least want to consider having them, right? Next slide. All right, so that covers the general scope of things, folks. We're going to go into some more specifics here. Going to go into specific segments of disability, starting with mobility, such as my own. And here we see some different representations of what that might look like. Wheelchairs as a given. I mean, it is the symbol of disability after all. So that is the sort of first instinct. But there are rollators, there are crutches, there are even some with more ergonomic designs, as you see at the top left there with the gentleman with the green shirt. But the one missing here is the lack thereof. You could have a mobility disability and not use any of these devices. Or you might have something tucked away under your pant leg that no one else can see but you. So also part of that consideration as well. So here's some mobility disability basics. We see a gentleman here. It doesn't look like he's having a good time. And that's a recurring theme in our presentation. You're going to see a lot of folks in these photos just having a bad time. But here's one example. We see a young man here, and there's a young lady who's, I think, doing her best, or at least what she thinks is her best, to assist here. Probably comes from a place of empathy, like most of us do, and is trying to do the right thing. But back to my previous slide, she didn't ask how she could assist, right? And that's what led to this awkward interaction here. So why is that? A person's wheelchair is part of their personal space. I certainly consider it to be. You'd be surprised how many times someone will try to grip onto my wheelchair on a crowded subway ride, and I have to politely say, I would let go of that wheelchair, because if you haven't been asked to assist somebody, pushing or touching that mobility device is considered inappropriate for one, dangerous, and also quite litigious too. Lawyers are expensive, aren't they? So if you haven't been asked to move a person's crutch, cane, or mobility device, if it's in the way, don't do so. Instead, you want to ask them to do so, or ask if you could do it on their behalf. Because back to Arthur's previous point, that could create a disabling condition. Now you're stuck in the waiting room wondering, where's my cane? Next slide. Great. So with interacting with wheelchair users, we see two examples here. On the left side, we see two gentlemen sitting down. One is a wheelchair user, one is not. On the right side, we see the same gentleman pictured. The non-wheelchair user is standing at a slight distance. And why is that, you might wonder? Well, for one, it's out of good practice to do so, simply because it could create an awkward power dynamic in the conversation. I mean, if you think about what the word condescending means, it literally means to look down on somebody. But also, in a more physical sort of medical sense, I suppose, looking up for 15 to 20 minutes while you're talking about the weather. I mean, I'll hear you out for the first 10 or so, but after those 10 minutes, my neck might start to hurt, to be quite frank. And so by doing this, you could alleviate that stress, whether it's emotional or physical, from someone who is a wheelchair user. All right. So you want to think about accessibility of your spaces as well. Being aware of those reach limits. Here's another disgruntled gentleman. He's trying to reload his stapler here. And where are the staples? Oh, they're all the way at the top shelf there on the left side. And by the look on his face, he's not having a good time. So again, someone like me, am I going to reload the Xerox machine with 1,000-count paper? Probably not. But those everyday items, staplers, pens, computers, phones, mice, keyboard, and all the associated tools that are used for those things, you want to keep within reach. You also want to be mindful of desk heights and chair positions as well, especially in that conference room setting, right? Because inclusion is not only being able to have a seat at the table, it's being able to reach the table to begin with. So you also want to keep aisles and walkways clear in your spaces. Next slide. All right. Wrapping us up here with the mobility slides. Keep accessibility accessible. Here's another person having a bad time trying to access the service ramp here. And this person is being blocked by, wouldn't you believe it, a cop car. That's a police car. That says policía. In Spanish, that's police. So, begs the question, what good is an accessible ramp if it's not accessible, right? So you want to keep these ramps and accessible doors and entryways to all of your facilities open and unblocked as best you can, or at least provide a mechanism for someone to provide assistance if needed. All right, so we have some resource slides coming up next, which we'll probably skip. And I'll pass it back over to Arthur to cover blind and low vision.
All right. Thank you so much, Eli. If you haven't noticed, that one of the major themes so far has been not to make assumptions, right? So we have a couple kind of archetypal images here of blind people, one using a cane and the other using a guide dog. These are just two examples. There are people who don't use either, some that use both. Some that switch off between a cane and a dog. One day you might see them with a dog, the next with a cane, just depends. Some people wear sunglasses or prescription glasses, some don't. It's varied. All right, some blind and low vision basics. So when you it's important to know that blindness has a wide range, that most people who are blind actually have some amount of vision. So just because a person identifies as blind doesn't mean that they can't see anything at all. Something like 90% actually have some amount of vision. And of course, that amount is going to be in a wide range. Our hearing and our sense of smell are not better. We just pay more attention to them. Since we don't have the vision to rely on, then we're going to use our other senses to get the similar information, and so we're going to just pay attention. But it doesn't mean it's better. It doesn't mean we hear more than somebody else or smell better than somebody else. So funny story. If you ever are at the mall with me and you want to find the food court or Cinnabon, I'm your guy. I can help you out there. Very, very good at detecting those things. I love Cinnabon, if you haven't noticed. All right. And just keep in mind that the biggest barriers for people who are blind or have low vision is access to information and low expectations. And really, I think those can be generalized to everybody with a disability. If you think of access generally, whether it's to information or to services or education, jobs, physical access, right? And then those low expectations. All right, so when you're interacting with a blind person, you want to make sure that when you're speaking to them, you introduce yourself and make sure that they understand who you are. Even though you may have spoken to them before, they may just not recognize your voice, or have heard enough of your voice to recognize it. So just say your name, and they will, know who you are, and know that you're speaking to them specifically, right? And when you're walking with a blind person, stay on the opposite side of their mobility device, their cane, their dog, whatever it is, just to provide a little more space for them to use it. You can offer to read written materials or help to fill out forms. There's nothing wrong with that, especially if they're not accessible. Hint, hint. And if you are going to guide a blind person, be prepared to either provide physical guidance or to give them an arm or give them directions, verbal directions. And then here's that hint: make sure to have print materials available in alternative formats, such as large print, braille, or accessible electronic formats. Interacting with blind people continued. If you see a blind person in public, there's no need to make a scene or call attention to them. Our colleague Wale used to tell what I think is a very funny story. He's walking down 23rd Street, heading to a restaurant to meet up with some friends. And he knows he's getting close, so he stops when he hears some people walking by. He asks if this restaurant is close by. And before they have an opportunity to answer, he hears, pounding feet, somebody running down the sidewalk behind him, and a woman yelling, "Wait, wait, wait, I'm a nurse, wait." And he's like, "Oh man, somebody must be, having some issues. Let me step aside and let her pass." So he's waiting for her to go by, and she runs up to him, grabs his arm, and says, "Okay, I'm here, I can help." He's like, well, thank you, but I don't really need a nurse. So there's no need to make a big scene. There's nothing wrong with wanting to help somebody. If you think that somebody needs help, identify yourself and ask if they need help, but be prepared for no. No means no. Don't insist on helping anyway, or my favorite is, as soon as I say no, when somebody asks if I need help, no, I'm good. Are you sure? So you don't need to do that. No is no. And just because they're turning you down doesn't mean they think anything less of you, right? I'm sure they appreciate the offer, but they're good. As Eli pointed out, that struggle can be helpful, right? You don't know where they are in their disability journey, and they really may be practicing that, walking down the street and finding the corner activity, right? Or crossing the street or whatever it is. But if they say yes, then the next question should be, how can I help? Don't assume that you know. You want to ask how. All right, so we talked about the two ways of providing guidance. The first is human guide, or some people call it sighted guide. We like to say human because there are some blind people who guide other blind people. My wife is also blind, and I guide her all the time. So if you are going to provide physical guidance, you want to keep in mind that you want to find out which arm that they're going to prefer to use. And this is, I want to emphasize this, this is them grabbing onto your arm, not you grabbing theirs, right? So going back to that idea of agency, right? You want the person to be in control. And so they're going to grab your arm. You want to keep your arm straight, not bent at the elbow, and against your body. Two reasons for this. You want it to be straight because that provides more arm to grab a hold of, right? If it's bent at the elbow, it's a little harder to grab onto because there's less arm to grab. And the elbow joint tends to be right at the height where somebody would grab, and then when it's bent, it becomes awkward. And you want your arm to be straight against your body and not, out like a chicken wing, because as you're moving, right, let's say you have the side step to the left or the right to avoid something, that movement's going to kind of get telescoped out to the end of your arm where they're holding, and there's going to be a delay. So if your arm is straight down against your body, then as soon as you move, they're going to detect that and be able to immediately adjust walking beside you. When you come to narrow spaces, you just want to announce that you're coming to a narrow space and put your arm behind you. Hold it away from your body as much as is comfortable to give them space to walk behind you. They're going to slide their hand down and grab your wrist and walk behind you. And then for stairs, you just want to announce that there's some steps coming up, and you want to especially tell them which direction they go. So stairs going up, stairs going down. Nothing worse than going up some downstairs or down some upstairs. It's very awkward. And then for seats, for chairs, make sure that they understand the orientation. So we're gonna want them to touch both the back of the seat and the bottom of the seat, so they know how to orient themselves in the chair. Verbal guidance, or what I like to call human GPS. So there are a lot of blind people who take pride in their independence and really want to explore their environment and be in control of where they're going. So they're going to want, instead of being physically guided, they're going to want directions. They're going to want to be able to take that opportunity to explore. So to give those directions, you want to avoid vague language, such as over there, this way, that way. Now imagine if you had your GPS out, you were programming and you're going to a new friend's house, not sure where it is, you want to use the GPS, and you plug in all the info and you hit go, and it says, all right, navigating to Molly's house. First, go that way. You're going to be like, what, huh? You're going to be banging the thing on the table, like, what's wrong with this thing? That it's not helpful. You want precise language that to use. So start with things like left and right, straight ahead, behind you. These are way more helpful than over there, that way, especially because those are typically followed by a pointing gesture, which the person's not going to be able to see, right? There is one exception to that, over here, meaning come to my voice, right? That is one exception, particularly for somebody who doesn't have hearing loss. That can be helpful. But beyond that, you want to be precise. If it is kind of a complicated thing, it's not directly left or right or ahead, you could always think of them as standing in the middle of a clock face, and they're facing forward is 12 o'clock, behind them 6, to the left is 9, to the right is 3. So you might say something like, oh, the trash can is at your 10 o'clock ahead of you, right? And that can give them a sense of what direction to go in. So directions are going to be, the major waypoints. You're not going to give tons of detail, like every little object that might be in their way to avoid. You just want to give them the basic sense of where they're going. and they will be exploring the environment and finding their way. So an example might be if you're out on the street, where's XYZ restaurant? Oh, walk 3 blocks ahead, turn to the left, cross the street, walk 2 more blocks, and it should be the second door. If you're inside, you can use hallways and doorways as waypoints. So walk to the end of this corridor, turn left, pass 2 doors, and it's the first door you come to after that on your right, right? That sort of thing. If it's complicated, complex directions, like maybe you're in the lobby and they need to go up to the 22nd floor someplace, just get them the directions they need to get to the elevators to get up to that floor, right? And then they'll take it from there. Once they get up there, they'll ask somebody else probably. If you know which direction out once they leave the elevator to go, that could be helpful, but you know, you can trust that they will ask somebody else once they get to that next waypoint. All right. So accommodations, I'm going to quickly go through these because I think it's helpful. We talked generally about these when we had talked about having things in alternate formats, but large print, which we define as 18-point sans serif font with a 4.5:1 ratio. I know that's technical, and if you're interested in more of learning more about accessible documents and how to create them, we have presentations coming up, I believe in 2 weeks, another set of Monday, Thursday presentations, and you'll learn all about that. Braille, which is a series of dots that represent letters or groups of letters in whatever language the Braille is for. So English Braille or Chinese Braille or French Braille or German Braille or whatever it is. Accessible electronic documents. These are, you know, Word docs, PDFs, PowerPoints that have been made accessible. And then audio description for videos. This is an additional track on the video that, in addition to the dialogue and music and whatever, that describes the major visual aspects or major visual things that are going on that are important to that video. If ever you want to check out audio description, if you have Netflix, you can, pretty much every Netflix original has audio description, so you can just turn it on and check it out. We had a colleague who wasn't blind who would watch Stranger Things with audio description on because he liked being able to walk around his apartment and do chores and not have to be standing in front of the TV to know what was going on. So he used it to his advantage. All right, and these are some resources. I won't go through these. You'll get the deck. So we're going to move to the deaf and hard of hearing community. Tony, our colleague, is the one who usually does this. I'm just going to skip this slide because I'm not Tony. So the deaf and hard of hearing community, some basics about them. It's important to note that not every deaf person communicates in the same way. Those who identify as deaf with a capital D consider themselves to be part of the deaf culture, right? Which has its own, you know, language, art, humor, customs. These things are all kind of part of that community, and they consider themselves to be a part of that. Members of the deaf community have a tendency to be very blunt and direct because they tend to not have easy access to the same kinds of information that we have as hearing people, particularly to like side conversations and, you know, just little bits of information that we pick up just in our daily lives as we hear things. They don't have that ability or that advantage, so they don't have all the same information. So they may ask you something like, "Oh, how much money do you make?" And, you know, they're not trying to be rude. They really are just curious and don't see any other way to know that. For most deaf people, it's important to understand that English is not their first language. Typically ASL or American Sign Language is their first language, and it truly is a language of its own. It's not any different than communicating in, you know, Spanish or French or Chinese or Russian or some other language. It's completely different from English. Different grammar, different structure, and so When you're using sign language to communicate, that communication happens through not just the hand gestures, but also through facial expressions and body movements in order to really provide that full message as you're using ASL. All right, interacting with the deaf community. So when you need to get a deaf person's attention, you can do a couple things. You can flash the lights if you're in a room. You can lightly tap on their shoulder, or maybe you know, if they're in front of you, you can wave your hand in front of them to get their attention. If you see deaf people together, they may have different ways of getting each other's attention. And so, you know, if you see somebody banging on the table or stomping on the floor, you know, those are ways that they're using to get the other person's attention. Some people make a you know, a deep noise, and the other person can feel the vibrations. You know, they develop kind of their own systems for getting each other's attention. You want to find out if the person prefers sign language, gesturing, writing, or speaking. Back to the very first point that they all communicate, that every deaf person communicates differently, right? So if you're speaking, there is no need to speak super loudly, right? You just want to speak in your normal tone of voice, your normal volume, a normal amount of pronunciation and enunciation. When you overdo any of those things, it actually makes it harder for somebody with hearing loss to understand what you're saying, right? It's easier if it's just the normal tone of voice, normal volume, normal speed. And make sure that you communicate with in an area that has sufficient light, especially if the person is lip reading or using ASL or writing, you know, texting, any of those things. I mean, all those visual means of communication need light. So make sure there's plenty of light. All right, when communicating with those who are deaf, if you're not familiar with sign language, you can easily communicate by writing or using your phone to type texts, right? What you're saying, make sure that you keep it short and to the point. Remember that English is very likely not their first language, so you just want to be concise. Think of the concepts of plain language, right? This helps those who don't speak English natively or read English natively in this case. When using an ASL interpreter, it's important to maintain eye contact with the deaf person, not their interpreter, right? You want to look at the deaf person as if you're actually talking to them, because, well, you are actually talking to them. The interpreter is there just to simply interpret and to facilitate that communication. If you're looking over to the interpreter and addressing the interpreter as opposed to the deaf person, that is seen in the deaf community especially as very rude. And then have patience, right? With anything, you just want to be patient. All right, some deaf and hard of hearing accommodations. We're generally going to skip these, except I like to do them for blind and deaf, just because I think they're useful to know. So ASL, which we've talked a lot about, there's also assistive listening devices or systems. Essentially, these are a microphone that communicates to a set of headphones that the person wears in order to get whoever's speaking's voice directly, you know, into their ears without, you know, cutting down on the background noise. A looped system is a type of assistive listening system, but the audio from the microphone is piped directly into the person's hearing aid or cochlear implant, or the setting they switch to, and it picks those signals up. CART is a live translation or live transcription, rather. So if you're in like an in-person meeting that has CART, you'll see a transcriber at the front typing away on their little shorthand machine, and it's putting the text up onto a screen in real time. If we had CART on this meeting, it would, instead of having the AI generate the captions, it would be a live person doing it. Then there's closed captioning, which is the dialogue from a video in text on the bottom of the screen that can be turned on and off. This is the most accessible version of captioning for videos because it allows people who use access technology to get a hold of that text because it is actually text. It's not an image. All right. These are resources. Again, you'll get the slide deck and we will move to speech disabilities and I'll pass it to Eli.
Great. Thanks again, Arthur. All right, folks, we're rounding home here. Just a handful of slides to go before we could open it up to some questions. So feel free to have those ready. So with speech disabilities, you want to give the person your full attention. And don't try to interrupt them or finish their sentences. It can be so tempting to do so, even when you know what the answer is already. But if you don't understand, tell them, ask if they can repeat themselves. If this doesn't work, you could offer to write or text. I like to use a 3-strike rule with these with constituents that come into the office for services, but if these do not work at all, I'll try to rephrase my question as a yes or no. This will allow for a quicker response, and I'm not taking away that person's voice. And that's the important thing here. You don't want to speak for them. You want to give them the agency to do so on their own, back to Arthur's point. All right. We can move on. All right, speech disability accommodations, we could skip that. Learning disability community. These are disabilities that interfere with a person's ability to receive, express, or process information. And oftentimes these are the ones that are the hardest to pick up on. You know, Bob from accounts receivable could have a learning disability and you would not know until the Christmas party. If you even find out then, you might not even detect it then. Because every person with a learning disability is different. And that goes across the board for a lot of these disabilities, for all of them really, but especially with this community, because you know, the diagnoses and the manifestations are so nebulous. For example, dyslexia, the mayor identifies as dyslexic, for example. Dyscalculia, which is the math version of dyslexia, to put it simply, it's numbers instead of words. But there are others, you know, auditory processing disorders, language processing disorders, to name a few. So that kind of wraps up learning disabilities here. Accommodations, we could skip. Resources. On to developmental disabilities. This is a huge umbrella term, and there's a whole lot of overlap here, but to put it succinctly, it's a group of conditions due to an impairment, again, using that word in the legal sense, right? In physical, learning, language, or behavior areas. And these are conditions that manifest either at birth or shortly thereafter during the developmental period. And they usually last for a lifetime. And they do impact that day-to-day functioning that Arthur described earlier, the eating, the dressing, cooking, working, all of those daily life activities. Some examples include cerebral palsy, spinal bifida, to name a few. The interesting thing about those two is that those two are also mobility disabilities, right? So again, back to the pie chart we saw earlier, one of the reasons why those numbers are so convoluted is because you could have more than one disability. You could be blind and deaf. You could have a mobility disability and have PTSD stemming from it. Wink. Moving on, I think the biggest one out of this list is autism spectrum disorder, which falls under a smaller umbrella, but an umbrella nonetheless, known as neurodiversity. And I'll turn it back over to Arthur to close this out.
All right, thank you, Eli. So neurodiversity is a term that was coined in, I think Wendy said today it was in the 60s. To describe a range of differences in an individual's brain function and behavioral traits, and is regarded as part of the normal variation within the human population. You know, there's a saying in this community that if you've met one person with autism, then you've met one person with autism. Like learning disabilities, they're varied, and a person's experience is unique, having their own individual strengths and needs and desires, etc. So, all right. So, people with autism. When you're speaking to a person who's on this autism spectrum, you want to make sure to speak clearly, using simple sentences. Try to avoid sarcasm, figures of speech, idioms, irony, and other expressions. They may not understand it. They tend to process information very literally, and so they may miss your meaning. So it's good to just speak clearly. Again, think of that plain language, right? Those concepts. You want to ask specific questions, avoid open-ended questions, to Eli's point about yes, no. When providing instructions, include detail and specificity. Don't assume that they know to do X before Y if you didn't actually tell them in the instructions. Even though it seems obvious to you, it may not be to them. Be direct when starting and ending a conversation or an interaction. We had a job seeker who came to our office a few years ago, and at the end of that meeting, we said, all right, see you later. And they left, and a few hours later, they come back, and we're like, oh, did you forget something? Can we help you with something else? And they're like, no, you said I'll see you later, so I came back. So you just want to make sure you're direct and specific in starting and ending conversations. Anticipate direct and honest responses to your questions, and understand that individuals may not maintain eye contact with you. This isn't a slight on you. They're not being rude or disrespectful. Doesn't necessarily mean, if they're in a job interview, that they're anxious or uncomfortable. It's just that this may be something that they are not easily able to do. So they don't. All right, developmental disability accommodations. I'm not going to go through these again. You will get the slide deck and resources. Mental health disability community. So mental health disabilities are a broad range of mental and behavioral conditions that affect your mood, thinking, and behavior. Sorry for reading that directly, but I wanted to get that point out. Many people have, mental health concerns, right? We get sad, we get anxious, we get happy, these are all normal emotions that everybody has as part of being human. And but when you have those ongoing signs and symptoms that start to interfere with those major life activities, you think back to the definition of disability, then that's when it starts to become a mental health disability. Some common mental health disabilities are anxiety disorders, mood disorders, and schizophrenic disorders. Here are some de-escalation techniques. If you do find yourself in a high-stress situation with somebody, keep these things in mind. Again, I'm going to paraphrase a bit so we have plenty of time for questions. But the real thing to keep in mind is you want to be empathetic and empathetic and non-judgmental. Make sure that you remain calm and professional. Think about your own physicality, your body language, your facial expressions, your gestures, and make sure that those match that calm professional demeanor, right? You want to focus on their actual concerns, right? What's happening and what they're concerned with. Focus on problem solving. Be prepared to use mirroring language perhaps, or to make sure that they understand that you understand what's happening and what their concerns are. So saying back what you heard in order to verify that that was accurate. Recognize that when a person is in a high stress state, oftentimes they're not able to quickly assimilate the things that you're saying, right? They're not able to process it because their mind is elsewhere in that stressful state. And so you want to just make sure that you provide plenty of quiet time during your conversation in order for them to process what you're saying, and have the opportunity for calmness. And then you want to answer questions, and try to ignore those aggressive behaviors that you may be seeing. But overall, be sure to be aware of the situation in order to keep yourself safe. Here are resources, and again, you will get the slides. All right. Our major resource, all of the accommodations and resources that we're providing came from this website, Job Accommodation Network, or JAN. AskJan.org. It's a really great website. Lots and lots of information and resources there. So we encourage you to use that to your heart's content. And now we are going to go to questions. Here's our contact information, by the way, in case you have a question you can't think of now and you want to ask us, feel free. All right. Do we have any questions?
Thank you so much. I don't see any at the moment. I'm going to ask one or two that maybe tie in, if that's all right. It sort of came up in the last session. Two-parter. I guess I was emailing with some space with some people about needing some space for us to do a meeting, and they said in the response, among other things, does it have to be handicapped accessible? Which I was sort of surprised at, and I would assume that it does. I mean, it does from our point of view. We cannot, as government entity, hold public meetings in non-accessible spaces. But the question also came up related to that, that somebody I seemed had been to a restaurant that was not accessible, and they asked about that. So if you come upon something any of us come upon something in our lives that is not accessible, what would we do, or what would be the appropriate action?
Good question. If you come across inaccessibility, or even feel like you've been discriminated against because of your disability, the best course of action is to put in a complaint with the City Commission on Human Rights. You can call 311 and ask to be connected to them, and they will, take the complaint. They'll investigate, and then work with the organization, the business, whatever it is, to address the situation and try to come up with a more accessibility there.
Okay, so the Commission on Human Rights.
Mhm.
There's a question in the chat that says, could you please compare the accessibility of Teams versus Zoom for remote meetings, and maybe WebEx too, while you're at it?
Great question.
Sure. I love talking about WebEx, actually, because I love making sure that people know that WebEx is terrible when it comes to accessibility. Probably the worst of all of them out there. So please don't use WebEx. I know the city had a contract with them for a while. Thankfully, we've switched over to Teams and Zoom. So, all right. So to the question,
at the beginning of the pandemic, WebEx was what was recommended to community boards or to use to provide it, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, please use Teams or Zoom, or even Google Meet is pretty good. So comparing Teams and Zoom, they're relatively comparable as far as accessibility goes, particularly when you think of it from a compliance standpoint. Zoom, we find, is just a little more user friendly. It's a little more intuitive. It's also better when it comes to ASL. Zoom just gives you more control over the interpreters and where they are on the screen and who can see them and how persistent their video is, etc. Teams is working towards that. They're trying to make strides, but I still think that Zoom is better in that. Teams is better in the auto captioning, the AI captioning, because Teams actually will identify in those auto-generated captions who's speaking. There are still going to be issues, right? It's going to have some trouble with proper names and not a lot of punctuation, but it is able to pick up who's speaking just based on where the audio is coming from within the meeting and you know, the name that's associated with that participant. So yeah, Zoom is actually cool in the sense that from an accessibility standpoint, it has the ability to go in and create custom keyboard shortcuts for things. So if you're a keyboard user using a screen reader or some other access technology that relies on a keyboard, you can customize your shortcuts if you'd like to make things easier to, you know, mute, unmute, share video, share, you know, this kind of stuff. So
and to sort of piggyback on what Arthur said there, in terms of the interface, right? You know, we have our little sort of Hollywood squares set up here right now, but I find that in Teams, it's a lot easier to get lost in the shuffle. So back to Arthur's previous point about ASL, where's the interpreter on the screen? And you know, to Arthur's previous point as well, it's like every piece of information is vital for that community, and even folks with cognitive disabilities as well, that need to constantly search for the person who's speaking, and some faces are bigger than others, and so on and so forth. And Zoom, just bar none, just knocked it out of the park in that regard. I mean, look how crisp it looks now. Everyone is the same size, and you know, everything is legible and clear. Even from an image quality standpoint, I find that Teams sometimes is a bit grainier than Zoom for some reason. That could just be me, but I've noticed that we get a lot better visual quality from Zoom than Teams.
yeah.
I don't see anything else in the chat, so we'll just say one last time if there's any questions people have. I did email this deck to everybody who registered for tonight. The video will get posted in a day or so after, or probably early next week after we get a chance to upload it, and I will share that. There are, as Arthur said, which one is our next week one? I should have looked it up. I forgot while I was doing.
I think if I remember right, next week is virtual meetings.
Yes,
Accessible virtual meetings.
I will share that with everybody as well. There's, if you haven't signed up for that, and then there is accessible documents.
Nice way to bookend the presentation then.
Yep.
Yes, yes. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, and we'll see you back at another workshop sometime soon. Thanks so much, Arthur and Eli.
Oh, our pleasure. Thank you, Benjamin.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Arthur.
Yep.